Good evening. Hi. How's everyone? Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight for this special event, a conversation with former Ambassador to Ukraine, William Taylor. Welcome, Ambassador. Well, as you know, this event is a joint effort between the Department of Political Science, the Barry M. Klein Center for Culture and Globalization, the Center for Civic Engagement, and the Southeast Michigan World Affairs Council. Let me be the first to welcome you. My name is Chaning Su. I am the director of the Barry M. Klein Center for Culture and Globalization. So as a newly established platform here at Oakland University in 2021, our mission is to bring the world to OU and to inspire engaged global citizenship. And tonight's event is a shining example of such effort. Tonight, we are incredibly fortunate to have Ambassador William Taylor to be with us, whose decades of diplomatic service, particularly his leadership during pivotal moment in Ukraine, offer invaluable insight into one of the most consequential conflicts of our time. As the war in Ukraine continues to challenge democratic value, test global alliances, and reshaping international dynamic, Ambassador's perspective will be not only timely, but deeply, deeply essential. As you can see, this evening is more than just conversation. It is a crucial opportunity for us to really reflect upon and engage with real-world diplomacy, to ask meaningful questions, to reflect on our roles in pursuing peace, justice, and informed action. So I want to thank you again for joining us tonight, and we hope this evening will inspire a lot of conversation that will extend well beyond this room. So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, also the director of Center for Civic Engagement Center, Dr. David Doolio. Dave.
Thanks, Chaning. And thanks to all of you for being here. The Center for Civic Engagement prides itself on several elements that are foundational to our work: freedom of expression, civility, and viewpoint diversity, to name just a few. Indeed, these foundational elements are appropriate and necessary at a college campus. If we don't have these, what are we? OU's staunch support of these principles starts at the top. So a hearty thank you to President Ora Hirsch-Peskovitz for her unwavering support. There's no bigger fan of the Center for Civic Engagement on our campus, and we're grateful for that. One thing we typically do at our CCE events is to remind everyone that we want to do more than just talk about civility. We want to practice it. With that in mind, here's a reminder of our tenets of civic engagement and productive dialogue. Think of these as guidelines for how we want this evening to go. In particular, we want to engage in respectful dialogue, employ honest listening, model civil behavior and tone, support free and open discourse, consider viewpoints other than our own, and find opportunities to agree, not just disagree. So we might not hear everything we like tonight. We might not agree with everything Ambassador Taylor says, but that's okay. That's part of a democracy. One quick side note: after tonight's program, I encourage you to head out to one of our campus's incredible landmarks, the Elliott Carillon Tower. You see it right out the windows as you walked in. After we conclude tonight, we're going to have a special treat from the assistant carillonneur at Oakland University, Professor Randy Engel. I'm not going to tell you what it is, but Randy's going to do something special for us tonight. A few quick thank yous: the entire Oakland Center team, Chris, Mike and his crew, the technical crowd, Xander in the back, our cameraman, and the executive events team, Patty, Sandy, Susan, and everybody in executive events. Thank you for all your help in putting this on. And I can confidently say that Ambassador Taylor would not be here today without the next person that I would like to bring to the stage, Lynn Partington. I met with Lynn several months ago now, and we hatched this plan for something called the Southeast Michigan World Affairs Council that would be modeled on World Affairs Councils across the nation by bringing and highlighting speakers of various perspectives and opinions. We are delighted to partner with Lynn and the Southeast Michigan World Affairs Council as we launch this speaker series. And with that, it is my pleasure to welcome Lynn Partington to the stage to introduce Ambassador Taylor and my colleague, Professor Trumbull.
Welcome, and thank you so much for coming to join us and celebrate with us the inauguration of this new Southeast Michigan World Affairs Council. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan, tax-deductible organization, and our mission is to provide community education on international issues. Nearly 100 World Affairs Councils in nearly every major city across the country host events featuring noted educators, politicians, scientists, journalists, and others. Today, we are living in a crazy world as we try to sort through misinformation, disinformation, and the information that's so nuts that you could think nobody could possibly make it up. Being informed, right? Being informed about international issues allows us to participate more meaningfully in discussions and debate about global challenges, to advocate for positive change, and to hold our leaders responsible for decisions that are in our nation's best interest. So, I'm just curious, with a show of hands, how many of you have attended or have been affiliated with the World Affairs Council in the past? Could you, with a show of hands? Excellent. So, could you just now shout out the name of the city and state where you were? Anybody else? Excellent. Okay, so we hope to, the next time you see me here, there will be all of you answering that question, obviously. So each council functions independently. However, each must finance itself independently as well. The council relies entirely on donations and a very low-cost membership that offers those who join the option to participate in receptions for speakers, as well as additional activities throughout the year. I want to thank Oakland University for supporting the establishment of a Council for World Affairs in Southeast Michigan. Special thanks for the hard work that Dave Dulio, the Director of Civic Engagement here at OU, has put in to make this evening a success. He's also the Vice President of our new council. Many thanks also for the efforts of our board members. Raise your hand when I call your name. Vicki Hofel. Did I see? Oh, Lana Latish, and especially Sundus Lewis, who put a website together and publicity in record time. As you can see, all the information that you need to become a member of the Southeast Michigan World Affairs Council, including a QR code, is on the screen. Click it, and voila, you are tonight a member of the World Affairs Council before you even get out of your chair. So we hope and we need for you to join us tonight as founding members in order to help us get a good start on a great organization. Council events will normally run from March, April, May, and then a summer break, and then September, October, and November. As this is our first season, we got a late start, but we plan to catch up with something special extra before the end of the year. So we hope this is a fresh start, we are brand new, and we hope that you will join us tonight. I do want to offer you a sneak preview now of our next event in May, when the focus will be on Afghanistan. Remember Afghanistan? After 24/7 media coverage in 2021, there's been very little information about the country. despite the fact that the UN has designated Afghanistan as the largest humanitarian crisis in the world. You will receive an update on the political situation from the most recent director for Afghanistan and Central Asia at the United States Institute of Peace, along with Chris Nadone, who will share with you the incredible story of the School for Boys and Girls that she founded there 25 years ago and continues to function. Most recently, rifts are growing among Taliban officials over the group's decision to ban girls from secondary education, leading at least one minister to leave Afghanistan and forcing families to move so their daughters can continue their schooling. You won't want to miss this program. You can find all the event announcements and membership information on our website, www.semiSemiWAC.org. Now, let's move on to the main event tonight. Our speaker this evening, William Taylor, is currently a senior fellow at the prestigious Atlantic Council. He served as the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine from 2006 to 2009 under Presidents George Bush and President Barack Obama, and charge d'affaires to Ukraine for President Trump. He has a deep knowledge of the country, of President Zelensky, and significant first-hand familiarity as to how President Trump approached Ukraine. He has met with President Zelensky more than 20 times, most recently last October. Before his years leading the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv, he spent 5 years working for the U.S. at NATO, 10 years coordinating U.S. support to former nations of the USSR, and he knows well the stark realities of the war and the various nations and players who may shape the future. He is a graduate of West Point and Harvard's Kennedy School and served as an infantry platoon leader and combat company commander in the U.S. Army in Vietnam. Ambassador Taylor will share the stage tonight with Chairman of the Political Science Department right here at Oakland University, Dr. Peter Trumbore, who also serves as the current Southeast Michigan World Affairs Council President. Please welcome to the stage Ambassador William Taylor and Dr. Peter Trumbore. And thank you so much. Please go on.
So thanks everyone for being here. First, before we get started with the questions for the ambassador, there is another QR code up there that gives you the opportunity to ask questions as well. So if you click on that now, you can set yourself up to ask a question. That question will go to my colleague Dave, and then he will forward those along to me as the evening continues. So as we get started, I wonder if you could briefly set the stage for us. What was the history of the Russia-Ukraine relationship prior to 2014, when sort of the current unpleasantness really sort of kicked off? How did we get here?
First of all, I am very pleased, honored to be here. This is an amazing response, and I'm so pleased to be able to talk about Ukraine in this community. And with all of you. So thank you very much for this opportunity. And let me also, we can get rid of that picture here. There is a map here, there we are. Okay, so Peter, this is a great question about how did we get here? Without going all the way back to the 9th century, when Kievan Rus, when the Ukraine. By the way, there are some Ukrainians, I think, in the room here tonight. Is that right? A couple of Ukrainians. Okay. So, keep me honest here. Keep me honest. But let me know. I'd love to hear from the Ukrainians as we go through the evening. But I start off with. I won't do all the history since the 9th century, but. the Ukrainians started out in Kievan Rus, in the 9th century. And those, not just the Ukrainians, but others who have been to Ukraine will know and have been to Kiev, the capital, marked there, you can see Kiev, will remember the St. Sophia's Cathedral that was founded during Kievan Rus, and it was finished. It was first constructed in about 1054. Again, you Ukrainians will keep me honest about this, approximately. And I say that because in 1054, when that culture culminated in that kind of a construction of St. Sophia's in downtown Kiev, Moscow was a forest. There was no Moscow. It was a swamp. Some would say it's still a swamp. However, I make that point because the Ukrainians' history goes back farther than the Russian history. The Russians will, there may be some Russians in the room. Let me just ask if there are. Okay, there you go. And you can keep me honest too. I look forward to these questions, which, by the way, it is really true that my favorite part of these kinds of conversations is the response from you, questions, challenges. Dave said that you might disagree with something that I said. Well, that will be your opportunity. I hope that's the case. So how did we get here? The Russians, as we know, started out in Moscow in about the 13th, 14th century and expanded to 11 time zones where they are right now, and took over a lot of territory. And they've dominated Ukraine, the part of the world in Southeast Europe, for a long time. The Russian Tsars dominated Ukraine. The Soviet Union snuffed out 1 year of Ukrainian independence in 1919. And so the Soviet Union kind of absorbed Ukraine during the Soviet times. Finally, when the Soviet Union disappeared in 1991, Ukraine became independent and has been proudly independent since then. But, and this gets to the more immediate thing, the Russians, in particular Mr. Putin, but not just Mr. Putin, has wanted to dominate Ukraine from the beginning, from his beginning. As I say, the Russians have dominated for a long time. Putin has maintained that and is kind of obsessed with that domination of Ukraine. President Putin has said and has written and has said in speeches that he doesn't think there is a Ukraine. He doesn't think Ukraine actually exists. It's not a real country, he has said. President Putin leaned over to President Bush, who appointed me to go out to Ukraine in 2006, and President Putin leaned over to President Bush and said, George, Ukraine's not a real country. He really believes this. And thus, he has made it his mission to dominate Ukraine. He tried, and I'm going to just show you a little bit here on the map. I told Peter that I would have to stand up. There we go. Okay, good. And well, I've got two of them, so I'll try to do this. So just to show you this map, first of all, so you'll get a sense, and I'll do it on both sides. So the borders of Ukraine go here. Now, this map is not perfect because they show in blue the part of Ukraine that the Russians took in 2022. So the blue part is still Ukraine. I mean, these are borders that go all the way around here, and these borders and around here. That's the 1991 borders of Ukraine, and the blue part here is not water. Water is down here. Here's the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. But this is where the Russians got to, and I'll come back to this. And this red part is what the Russians now occupy. And so I'll just, for people over here, so the borders go all the way around here. These are the borders of 1991. This blue part is not water. This is water down here, but this part is what the Russians occupied and were pushed out of, and the red part is what the Russians still have. So, what President Putin tried to do in 2008, and actually in 2004, when there was an election in Ukraine, and our Ukrainians in the room will remember the Orange Revolution. There may be others in the room remember the Orange Revolution, 2004, 2005, when President Putin tried to tilt that election in Ukraine toward his favorite candidate, Viktor Yanukovych. The people of Ukraine were outraged when they realized that that election had been stolen. President Putin tried to put his own man into the presidency in Ukraine. And the people went to the streets, Ukrainians went to the streets, into the Maidan in the central square, not just in Kyiv, but around the country, stayed there through that winter. Finally, President Yanukovych called out the military and the special forces to try to clear the Maidan and killed about 100 Ukrainians who had been protesting in the Maidan. And that brought more Ukrainians to the street. Finally, President Yanukovych fled to Russia, of course. They went to Moscow. That was the first way that President Putin tried to take over. The second way was when Yanukovych fled. I'm skipping forward now to 2014, when the same kind of a big demonstration took place. When Yanukovych, who was elected president in 2010, decided not to join Europe. The Ukrainians had decided they really wanted to join Europe in 2010, 11, 12, and in 2013, Yanukovych was headed to Brussels to sign an association agreement with the Ukrainians, with the Europeans, so that Ukraine could become a candidate member of the EU. And President Putin didn't want that to happen. So again, he took the action, bribed Yanukovych, $15 billion, promise of low natural gas prices, and President Yanukovych buckled to that bribe, tried to clear the streets, killed the 100 that I mentioned, fled to Russia, and the people then, the Ukrainians, took over and had an election. But that was the second time when Putin tried to do that. So he had failed in the two previous times. Long answer to your question, Peter, sorry. He tried to get his man elected in 2004. He tried to bribe that same Yanukovych in 2013, 2014. Failed both times. Finally, in 2022, he said, I'm just going to invade. And that's what he did. And here is where I mentioned that the Russians first invaded, and they took this blue part, and they got all the way to Kyiv. They got all the way to Kyiv. The Russians came down from Belarus. They came towards the west from the occupied Donbass here. They came from the south, an occupied Crimea. And the Russians got to the outskirts of Kyiv. They got to the suburbs of Kyiv to the extent that they had assassination squads. The Russians had assassination squads in the city looking for President Zelensky. This was how Putin wanted to take over. He wanted to kill or get rid of somehow President Zelensky, who had just been elected in 2019, when I got there the second time. And Putin wanted to get rid of him, so to take control of the country. And as you can see, that part in blue is no longer occupied by the Russians. The Ukrainians pushed them out and pushed them all the way back to the part that's in red. Longer answer than you probably anticipated, Peter, but that way.
But it does bring us to, I think, a critical question, and that is, in your assessment, could war have been avoided? How much did the failure of the United States and other Western states to respond to the seizure of Crimea in 2014, how much did that contribute to Putin's willingness, determination to invade in 2022? Did he learn the lesson that the United States and the West would not stand up?
He certainly learned some lessons about what the West would do. As you say, in 2014, he annexed illegally annexed Crimea, that peninsula at the bottom. And the United States, well, first of all, the Ukrainians couldn't resist at that time. Because of Yanukovych, this fellow that I mentioned, who had been kind of he was a Ukrainian president, but pro-Russian, and he'd allowed the Ukrainian military to hollow out corruption, bad procurements, so the Ukrainians were not in a position in 2014 to resist when Putin first invaded in 2014, first Crimea and then Donbass. And so the question you ask is, could the Americans or the Europeans or NATO have done something? If the Ukrainians, first of all, the Ukrainians didn't ask us in, but second of all, it's hard to imagine, I mean, I would ask people in this room, it's hard to imagine the president going to the American people, to Congress, and saying, we want to send the 82nd Airborne or the 101st, I was in both the 82nd and 101st, send these U.S. military to Crimea to try to push the Russians out of that. So there was not really the option to do that. But one last punchline on your question, which is, could it have been avoided? We put some sanctions on, we got not too serious ones, but my analysis that I've kind of laid out earlier was that Putin wanted to dominate Ukraine from the start. He was going to do it one way or the other. I don't think there were actions that we could have taken that would have deterred that.
So that's where my follow-up was going to go, because certainly one of the lines of President Trump in his first term was that this was all the fault of the Democrats, that the Obama administration had failed to deter Russia, and that had he been president, none of this would have happened. And so I want to come back to this question. Are you saying that Vladimir Putin was undeterrable on this point? It wouldn't have mattered what the United States had threatened. Not that I'm suggesting we ever would have threatened military action, but certainly we could have been more forceful in terms of assisting Ukraine's ability to defend itself, more than I think what were largely symbolic levels of sanctions. Could there have been a more forceful response from the West between 2014 and 2022 that might have led to some recalculation?
I think the answer is no, but the reason is that the ability of Europeans, Americans, NATO to actually deploy forces into Ukraine, which is what you're kind of suggesting, or taking much harder, could have done more sanctions, economic sanctions. Economic sanctions have their role, have their purpose, and may have accomplished some of those purposes, but they were not going to stop a Putin determined to go into Ukraine, to take over Ukraine. Now, would he have done it at the same time? Would Putin have gone at the same time? Hard to know. Hard to know. That was the 2014. The other thing to remember about 2014, a total surprise. A total surprise. It surprised the Ukrainians. It surprised the Americans. This was a quick response by Putin, obviously prepared. There was no doubt that the Russians had done some preparation, but a quick response by Putin to the fleeing when Yanukovych fled Kyiv and went to Moscow. Putin thought that was a big problem for him, and it was a big problem for him. And he did something that no one expected, which is to invade his neighbor for the first time since 1945 in Europe. There's a Middle East example, but in Europe this was the first time, and it surprised the Ukrainians, the Americans, and the Europeans. For a while there, President Putin denied it was even Russian troops.
The little green men.
Little green men with no insignia on their shoulders. And he said, no, it's not us. You know, a month later, he said, actually, it is us. But yes, that was a big surprise. So that was very difficult. It would have been extremely difficult to mount a military effort to do that.
So it seems that we're describing a a situation in which personalities are very central to the unfolding of events and the decision making, and chief among those personalities is Vladimir Putin. So, one of the questions that was submitted ahead of time asked about Putin, and in particular, does he have vulnerabilities that could potentially be exploited in order to try to bring the Russians to the table in a serious way? And then I'll ask a similar question about Ukrainian leadership.
This is a great question. This is why I'm very pleased. This is one of the issues that I want to be sure we address. That is how to get Putin to the table right now. Because he does have vulnerabilities. The answer to your question is yes, there are, and we can talk about these. What's going on right now, even now as we speak, is there are conversations between Americans and Ukrainians, and Americans and Russians, about similar things. I mean, as we know, they started off talking about a ceasefire, a 30-day ceasefire. And President Trump and President Zelensky agreed on a 30-day broad ceasefire, air, sea, and land. 30 days that they would stop the war, stop the fighting, stop the killing. As President Trump has said, that was his goal, even in the campaign. He made this point very clearly.
Of course, he also said he could do it with a single phone call.
He said he could do it in 24 hours. But nonetheless, that suggests to me and to a lot of people that he put a high priority on it. And again, he has kept that as a high priority, which it needs to be. If we're going to stop this war, stop this horrible war, then there needs to be that kind of negotiation that's going on. So conversations between the Americans and Ukrainians and the Americans and Russians, the Americans and the Ukrainians agreed on a 30-day across-the-board air, sea, and land ceasefire. Trump then takes it to Putin, and Putin says no. Putin says no. And Putin kind of says, well, maybe we can do it, we'll have a ceasefire against energy facilities, energy infrastructure. And President Trump took that back to President Zelensky, who reluctantly agreed. And that's what they're trying to negotiate now, is a ceasefire against each other's energy facilities. That hasn't been accomplished. That hasn't been agreed. There's no specifics on when it starts or who enforces it or what energy facilities there are that are not going to be attacked. But nonetheless, my main point there is, and I'm going to get to your question about how to put pressure on Putin. The main point there is Putin's the problem. Putin is the one stopping this ceasefire. It's not Zelensky, and it's not Trump. It is Putin. And there you get to the vulnerability, I think, of Putin. And that is, he runs the real risk right now of being seen, and I think for what it actually is he's the problem for one of President Trump's signature promises during the campaign, to end this war. And Putin is stopping him from doing that, and that irritation could lead President Trump to do a couple of things. One is, he could do what President Trump has said he would do if Putin was the problem, which is to arm Ukraine like they've never been armed before, he said. Right? He could do that. He could do that. He's also said, even more recently, he said about a week ago that he is suspicious, President Trump said he's suspicious that President Putin is dragging his feet.
That's a little obvious, but
And
okay.
The president's right. Putin is dragging his feet. And he said at that time, he said, if that's the case, then I can put sanctions on Russia, and in particular on nations that buy oil from Russia could be sanctioned by the United States. And that could have another big effect. The Russian economy, this is part of the answer to your question about vulnerability, the Russian economy is doing great on the military side. It's doing great. I mean, incredible resources are being channeled into the Russian military. The Russian civilian economy is in bad shape, is fragile. It's approaching hyperinflation. The interest rates have been jacked up. They've got a very good central banker in Russia. And she's trying to keep the economy going in the face of this incredible resource shift from the civilian economy to the military economy, and so she's had interest rates way up. That's having an effect on the whole economy on the civilian side. So Putin's vulnerable in that regard. There's one last vulnerability he has, which is Putin really wants to be welcomed back into the society of civilized nations, right? So Putin has been indicted by the International Criminal Court for war crimes. And the specific war crime that he's is indicted for is he's abducted, he has kidnapped children, Ukrainian children. At least 19,000 Ukrainian children been kidnapped intentionally by Russian forces in Ukraine, sent back into Russia, given Russian names, Russian passports, in Russian families, trying again to do what he said he was going to do, is wipe Ukraine off the map. That's what he's trying to do. And he's been indicted for that. And he can't travel to many places. And it's been a constraint. But President Trump has said he will be willing to talk to President Putin, even though he's an indicted war criminal. So President Trump has that leverage over him as well to bring him back into society.
So this sort of jumps ahead in sort of the list of questions that I was thinking about, but I want to stick with this theme for a minute, because I think there's a perception that when we think about what the American role could be, that when it comes to Russia, we're primarily thinking about the ability to offer Putin carrots. You're suggesting something different, and threaten Ukraine with sticks. Like what we saw relatively recently, the cutting off of intelligence sharing, the cutting of temporary suspension of military aid, and so on. What is the U.S. role here? Can we be, I don't want to say an honest broker, because I think that that's a loaded term, especially with this administration. But what is the role for the United States moving forward in this attempt to bring about at least a ceasefire, if not a full cessation?
Peter, I think there is an important U.S. role. And again, this is a new role brought to the front by the new administration. And that is an active pull to get both sides to the table. Even if it's, in Saudi Arabia, these conversations are in a hotel, and the Russians are on one floor and the Ukrainians on another floor, and the Americans go back and forth. But that bringing together, that forcing the conversation between Ukrainians and Russians through the Americans is an important role. The Biden administration before that, as I said, is responsible really for keeping the Ukrainians alive and in the fight, and backed up by NATO and by a coalition that includes our allies in the Far East, the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Australians, and New Zealanders, as well as all the Europeans. That was a major effort that the Biden administration should be proud of. You couldn't be proud of. However, what they didn't do, what the Biden administration did not do, is take an active role in trying to end the war. And that's what the Trump administration has tried to do so far.
But the Biden administration would have had the same, elements of leverage that Trump possesses. So what do you think explains that?
I think what explains that is President Biden did not want to push the Ukrainians toward a compromise or even toward negotiations until they were ready. So President Biden deferred to President Zelensky, and President Zelensky really represents Ukrainian people. There's not a divide at all at this point. Again, Ukrainians in the room will correct me if I'm misstating this. But President Zelensky has the support of the Ukrainian people, and President Biden did not want to push him to negotiate, compromise, cede territory, which is always a possibility. Whereas President Trump has said, I want to end this war. And he can end it well from the Ukrainian standpoint or from the international community standpoint by putting pressure on Putin to come to the table, make compromises, which President Putin doesn't want to do, but if there's enough pressure put on him, he can do. And President Trump can also bring President Zelensky to the table, which he has done in the ways that you mentioned. And President Zelensky has said that he doesn't want to make these compromises. He doesn't want to make concessions. He doesn't, but he wants to end the war, Zelensky has said. And President Zelensky has said, grudgingly, not at all with any enthusiasm, that he recognizes, and again, Ukraine to the room can help me on this, that Ukrainians recognize that right now, it's going to be very hard, maybe impossible, for the Ukrainians to take back that territory militarily. And the territory again, whoops, get rid of this picture. Let's get this map back here. There we are. So this territory is what the Russians have held in red here for the last 2 years. And I say for the last 2 years because the Ukrainians have held off the Russians. The first year they pushed them back out of that blue part to the north. But the second and third years, they've been fighting 3 years, more than 3 years, let's just be clear. The second and third years, they've held the Russians back for essentially no gain. But President Zelensky has said that he recognizes that now, with the current state of the war, and current state of his economy, and the Russian economy, and his military, and the Russian, he doesn't see a way that he can take back that area in red militarily. He says, I'm not going to be able to take that back. I can't push the Russians out of that occupied territory in red. What he has said he can do is get it back diplomatically. And he has in mind some negotiations, but he has in mind, example, after World War II, where we remember East Germany and West Germany. And West Germany never gave up claim to East Germany, even though the Soviets dominated it. And West Germany went on, as we know, to join NATO. West Germany went on to help develop what is now the European Union, develop a great economy, a good democracy. And the Ukrainians say, there's a model here. Even if we can't get back that part in red, that occupied territory, it's about 18% of their country. If we can't get back that 18% now militarily, we'll get it back. It will come back.
So there are a couple of good questions that have come in from the audience that I think will fit naturally here. But I do want to follow up really quickly on this last thing you were saying. So are you suggesting that Zelensky is in a position where he is willing to accept, on a temporary basis, territorial concession?
Yes. Again, reluctantly, he hates it. He hates the idea. It violates the principle of territorial integrity. It violates the principle of sovereignty that are enshrined in international law, in the UN Charter, and in his constitution, in the Ukrainian constitution. It defines that 1991 borders, which includes all that in red. So he does not want to give up legal claim to that. He's a realist enough, again, very reluctantly, and there'll be people who will oppose this, by the way. There'll be Ukrainians, maybe some Ukrainians in the room, who will oppose even that. There are some people, in particular, former military veterans who have come back and they say, we've been fighting for 3 years, and you're going to accept that the Russians are going to stay there, even if it's temporarily. There's going to be some opposition there. But President Zelensky has indicated that may be what they can, and the majority, when they do polling in Ukraine, again, the Ukrainians don't like this, but if it's going to be able to stop the war and allow them, the Ukrainians, to join the EU, and allow them eventually, conceivably, to join NATO, and allow them to develop their economy and their democracy in a way that they want to develop it, and then eventually get that back.
So there's two questions that I think play nicely off of what we were talking about just a moment ago. The first, as it relates to not just Putin's vulnerability, but perhaps to the weakness of the Russian state. And so one of the questions from the audience asks about the aborted Wagner coup, and what does that tell us about the fragility of Putin's control and the fragility of the Russian state? The other question that I think plays nicely into what you were just talking about is a question about when could we expect conditions to be appropriate to allow elections in Ukraine, because as you mentioned, as we talked about before we came on stage, there haven't been elections since the war's been underway, and I think for understandable reasons. So sort of two questions sort of related to each other, right? What does the aborted coup tell us about the strength or weakness of the Russian state and Putin's control over the state? And at what point might Ukraine be able to return to some sort of democratic normalcy?
Wagner and elections. So on the Wagner question, and again, we remember that that the Wagner group was fighting in the eastern part of the country. It was fighting around Bakhmut, which is in the center part of the occupied, on the line there, occupied territories. And actually, the Wagner group was making some progress. After they took Bakhmut, then they withdrew under Prigozhin, the leader of the Wagner group, and he pulled all his troops all the way out of Ukraine and back into Russia, took over a military district headquarters without any Russian pushback whatsoever. This gets to your point. And then started marching toward Moscow. And so Prigozhin, head of Wagner, had some reason to believe that the Russian chain of command was fragile, and that there were military generals and units that would fall in behind him and support him in going up toward Moscow. And he got partway up, kind of looked around, nobody behind him. Nobody there. And so he called it off. But that did demonstrate the fragility of the chain of command. And it did indicate that Putin has some things to worry about, which he clearly does. They've taken some steps to crack down even further, both on the military and more broadly, the Russians have. Elections. This is a great question. This comes up, and I'm glad the question came up from people in the audience. That is, during wartime, the Ukrainian constitution says that you can't have elections, essentially. It says you can't have elections when there's martial law. And martial law is established by the parliament, by the Rada. And they have to extend it every 6 months, which they have done. That is not a controversy. And as I say, the Constitution prohibits elections during martial law and thus during. So your question's a good one. And by the way, Putin uses that. Putin says, Zelensky is not legitimate because his term's up. Well, yeah, his term's up because you invaded and they can't have elections. And the Constitution does say that the president stays in power until the elections. But this is a Putin line that is Zelensky.
Of course, it is a line that Donald Trump has repeated. Now, I guess there's some question as to how. I mean, I always hesitate to say we shouldn't take the man at his word, because I think we should. So he has repeated that talking point, describing Zelensky as a dictator.
He did say that, but then later on he said, "Did I say that?" So all to say, he did. All to say that this is a Putin talking point, and it is true. What you say is true, Peter. That is, some Russian talking points have gotten into administration officials, in particular the administration official who is most responsible for negotiating with the Russians and maybe with the Ukrainians, has gotten into that. But so as you mentioned, I've been to Ukraine 9 times since the big war started, and I'll be there again next month. And I always talk to Ukrainians, of course, is why I go. And I talk to opposition candidates and opposition political party leaders, and they say the same thing. They say, we can't have elections during the war. One reason is they can't have elections during the war is the soldiers want to vote. And some soldiers want to run. They want to be candidates. And if they're on the front lines, they can't be pulled off, and the Russians take advantage of that pulling off. No, so it's just practically you can't do that. There are millions of Ukrainians in Europe, outside the country. There's no way to get them. So there are practical reasons, but there's a legal reason, and it's perfectly legitimate for Zelensky to continue in the process.
So since we're on this topic of thinking about internal Ukrainian politics, one of the questions that was submitted in advance from one of the folks who registered asked about the depth of the political bench behind Zelensky. Right? What else is there in terms of Ukrainian leadership? And I think it's an interesting thing to think about in terms of contrast with what might be behind Vladimir Putin, if anything. So how would you characterize Ukrainian leadership beyond Zelensky, and then what does that look like on the Russian side?
So on the Ukrainian side, Ukrainian is a real democracy. Let's be clear. It's raucous. It's rambunctious. I mean, sometimes, you know, there's some fights on the floor of the parliament, the Rada. I mean, they feel strongly about things, and it's real debates. It's real democracies, and they have real opposition parties. So the answer to your question about a bench, about who could take over, there's a constitutional answer to that question, of course. If President Zelensky had been, kidnapped by the Russians, or if something happens to him, the Constitution says that the Speaker of the Parliament, the Speaker of the Rada, takes over and calls an election within a couple of months. And that's exactly what happened in 2014 when Yanukovych fled. The Speaker took over, they elected President Poroshenko, Petro Poroshenko, and continued. So, President Poroshenko, a previous president, is still a candidate. He's not particularly popular right now, and again, our Ukrainians in the room will confirm that there's another perennial candidate, Yulia Tymoshenko, she was one of the prime ministers when I was there. She's still the head of a very, a party that has gone down, but nonetheless is there. There are at least two very popular generals who are reportedly candidates, could be candidates. I've met with both of them, actually. And I've detected in one, the kind of lead candidate, General Zaluzhny was the chief of staff of the army until about 8 months ago, and now he's the Ukrainian ambassador in London. But I talked to him, and I didn't sense a strong fire in the belly to be president. Nonetheless, he's very popular. So he could step up. There's a younger general, Budanov, whom I met with as well, who does have fire in the belly, and he could well be the military candidate. President Zelensky, as people in this room I'm sure know, had no previous government experience. I mean, he was the head of an entertainment company. Not only the head of the entertainment company, he was the lead actor. He was a stand-up comedian in some real sense. 2 sentences on that. So before President Zelensky was elected, he was this comedian and had a very popular TV series. It's called Servant of the People. And the story of the Servant of the People. This was a weekly show, and Servant of the People. The story is this diminutive high school teacher, a government high school teacher, who after school one day got so riled up about and it's instead in current Ukraine, or in Ukraine in 2013, 2014, and the teacher gets so riled up after class about the corruption of oligarchs in Ukraine and corruption in the government. And he goes ranting on this thing, and one of his students, of course, whips out his phone and gets him on video, and the video goes viral, and of course this high school teacher is elected president. And so here's Vladimir Zelensky, who is playing this high school teacher turned president, fighting corruption, and then in real life he's elected. And I say that because there are a lot of different ways to come to power. There's another, so Zelensky was a comedian. There is a very popular opposition leader. His name is Slava Vakarchuk. Again, our Ukrainian friends in the room will recognize his name. The leader of one of the most popular singing groups in Ukraine, who is a physicist. He's actually a physicist. He pointed out to me a couple of times. And he could be a candidate. All to say, there is a bench.
What about on the Russian side? Is
On
there
the Russian
anyone
side.
other than Vladimir Putin?
Probably. Probably, and be careful what you wish for, because it could be worse. It could be worse than Putin. It could be better, but sure. I mean, we've seen this kind of. It's not a democratic transition. There haven't been democratic transitions in Russia or the Soviet Union or the Tsars. That's not a tradition in that society. But the way it could happen, there could be. He has a Security Council, and there's people right around Putin in the Security Council in the Kremlin, some of whom could well take over. And one way it might happen, if Putin is making bad decisions, and he's made some bad decisions.
I was going to say, I mean, how many more bad decisions does he get?
You're exactly right. You're exactly right, Peter. He's made, and if he makes enough where he loses the confidence of those people right around him, they can do to him what they've done to other Soviet leaders, and they say, boss, we got a dacha for you outside. We got this. And they could just shuttle him off. It would be chaotic, and there would be uncertainty. It's by no means democratic. So you compare the two. I'm glad you asked it in that way, Peter. Compare the Ukrainian system and the Russian system, and that's what you've got.
So I want to come back to thinking about the United States' role in all of this, both in the present and sort of turning the clock back a little bit. And so in the present, after the Oval Office debacle, there were some criticisms that Donald Trump had switched sides. But based on what you've said earlier this evening, I might question that initial judgment. So I want to sort of get a sense from you of where you think the United States is and where Donald Trump is right now in terms of how he thinks about the sides. And then to look backwards, this is a question that came from the audience. And it's a question that I've fielded a handful of times when I've been asked to do media around this issue. And that is, if we go all the way back to the Budapest Memorandum, does the United States have a responsibility? Do we have a legitimate responsibility to secure the defense of Ukraine as a consequence of making that pledge when they agreed to give up their nuclear arsenal?
Yes, but in order. Let me come back to that. Where are we right now? I think the next couple of weeks is going to answer that question. And we might not know the answer to that question. President Trump may not know the answer to that question right this minute. We know there are people around President Trump who have different views. There are some people who are supporting Ukraine and have put these ideas of how President Trump could put some pressure onto Putin, militarily, economically. President Trump has come out and said a couple times he's angry, he's pissed off with Putin. So there are people clearly making those points. President Trump is going to make the decision. There are others, we know, who don't care a lot about Ukraine. The Vice President has said that during the campaign. So I don't know. I don't think anyone really knows where that's going to come out. But I think we will know in the next couple of weeks, because I think there's going to be a recognition that Putin is the problem, and Trump has some leverage, as I mentioned earlier. We'll see, or not. But that's not going to be a long. The Secretary of State has made exactly this point. A couple of days ago, he said, "We're going to know in weeks, not months." He was trying to answer exactly that question. We're going to know in weeks, not months, he said. And the question, what Rubio said, was the question is really for Putin. Are you going to be part of the peace process? Are you going to come to the table? Are you going to make these compromises so we can end this war or not? And if not, which is all the indication right now, then we will see what President Trump does. Budapest Memorandum, right, so just one sentence, so probably most people know about this one, but in 1991, when the Soviet Union disappeared, there were nuclear weapons in 4 Soviet countries, ex-Soviet countries. Russia, obviously, Kazakhstan, Belarus, but the second largest after Russia was Ukraine. And the Kazakhs and the Belarusians turned in their nuclear weapons back to the Russians. The Ukrainians didn't. And there was a lot of pressure on the Ukrainians to give up what was then the 3rd largest nuclear arsenal in the world give it up. Give it up, which we, the Americans and the Brits, put some real pressure on President Kuchma to do this. This is President Clinton. Put some real pressure on President Kuchma to sign this Budapest Memorandum, which said they'll give up this third largest nuclear arsenal in the world, and they will abide by the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They wouldn't develop their own weapons. If the other side of that deal at the Budapest Memorandum was if the other signatories on the memorandum guaranteed Ukrainian security, guaranteed that they wouldn't be invaded, guaranteed that their sovereignty would not be violated. And we see what happened. And so your question is, do we have an obligation? I think the answer is yes. I think we as Americans have an obligation to do that. Now, it is true. I know a friend of mine actually helped negotiate the Budapest Memorandum. And I said, Steve, what was the deal on this? And he said, well, Bill, it came down to the word guarantee. And in Russian and in Ukrainian, the word is guarantee. The translation into English is assurance.
Those are not the same thing.
They're not the same thing, and there's a real practical reason they're not the same thing, which is if we were to have given a guarantee, we'd have to take it to the Senate and get 66 votes in the Senate. That obviously wasn't going to happen, didn't happen. So Americans thought we gave an assurance, a political guarantee, a political assurance. The Ukrainians thought it was a guarantee. And the Russians violated that, as we know, in 2014 when they invaded it the first time, and then in 2022.
So we're up against 8 o'clock, and I want to make sure we honor people's time, but we've got a few more questions that I think I'd like to ask. And one of them touches on something that you and I were talking about backstage earlier, and it touches on things we've also been discussing for the last 45 minutes or 50 minutes, and that has to do, again, thinking about the United States' role in all of this. And thinking about Donald Trump as a very transactional leader. And this whole idea of a mineral rights agreement between the United States and Ukraine, 55 pages of which were distributed to the Ukrainians. The description of that, and as you said to me, you've read all 55 pages. It's essentially as if we had defeated Ukraine in war and laid claim to their natural resources and their economy. What is your take on that? And where do you see, does the prospect of those resources, does that give the United States greater incentive to take a more active role?
So the argument that the Trump administration makes, in particular the Secretary of Treasury, who has been leading on this negotiation, on this minerals deal, the argument is that if there are American companies in there mining and developing these resources, that is kind of a security guarantee because the Russians wouldn't dare attack the Ukraine where these Americans are working. Well, the Ukrainians are not convinced. The Ukrainians do want a security guarantee. That is crucially important. Back to when we were talking about this ceasefire, the Ukrainians are willing to make these hard compromises and willing to accept that areas in red won't come back right away if they get a real guarantee for their security. And the Americans possibly coming in over a decade to develop the lithium deposits or the nickel deposits or whatever they are, falls well short of that, number one. And number two, this 55-page version is the second cut. The first cut was again presented to the Ukrainians by the Secretary of Treasury, and he said, so the Secretary of Treasury says to President Zelensky, here's our proposal. We need you to sign this in an hour.
And he was in the Oval Office to do that very thing.
And so this was in Kyiv, where the Secretary of Treasury went in and said to Zelensky, here it is, sign it in an hour, and then we'll go have a meeting. And President Zelensky said, Actually not. Actually, the way we do these things is the lawyers agreed that, I'll consult with people who understand these things, and we may make a counter proposal, which they did. So President Zelensky said, not so fast, let's negotiate this a bit. But then you're right, they did negotiate, and the 5-page version, they basically agreed to some of the changes that the Ukrainians had proposed, and that was to have been signed after that disastrous Oval Office meeting that has a lot of weird things about that, which we could talk about. But it wasn't signed for reasons that we know. And so then this 55-page version shows up, same kind of thing. It's presented to the Ukrainians and asked for an agreement right away. Again, President Zelensky has said, actually, no, let's take a look at this. I'll give you my reaction. And that's kind of where we are right now. They may agree. But you're right. When you read the American draft, this latest draft, this longer version, it's very lopsided, I will say. So we'll see how that, but President Zelensky has made it clear that he's going to do a counter proposal.
So you'd mentioned earlier that that Putin has been charged with war crimes, and there are obviously some significant practical issues about bringing Putin before the International Criminal Court. So I'm wondering, for those who don't necessarily study international law the way that certainly you have, okay, I teach it when I have to. What is the practical impact of Putin facing an indictment for war crimes?
The practical, so unless Putin loses, so if Russia loses this war, and if he's deposed or something, and a new regime comes into Moscow, then there could be some practical, there could be trials. Putin could end up in The Hague and have unlikely at this point. So what are the practical implications? The practical implication is that Putin worries about where he travels. So every nation who signed the Rome Statute that sets up the International Criminal Court is obligated to arrest Putin if he lands on their territory. Now, we haven't signed.
So yes, you should know that the United States, for those of you in the audience who
Neither
don't
the
know,
United
we
States
did not sign this.
We did not sign, nor did the Russians. But the South Africans did. And when Putin wanted to go to South Africa to join the BRICS, the BRICS meeting, the South Africans said, you better not go. And so he didn't. Now, he did go to Mongolia. He did go to Mongolia and wasn't arrested. But that's a practical thing. And so it's more symbolic at this point. And he's not going to end up in The Hague unless Russia loses. But that's an indication that he is outside of civilized nation society.
So I think we'll make this again to honor everyone's time, including yours.
And I saw the Caroliner.
Oh, the Caroline.
The person who's going to do the.
There you go. Right. So let's make this the last question.
This is going to be worth listening to. I'm told.
We've talked about a lot of really heavy things over the last 55 minutes, and so this is another question from the audience. Totally shifting gears, but what was your most enjoyable experience about being ambassador to the Ukraine?
Most enjoyable experience was the opportunity to travel around the country and talk to Ukrainians. Some people knew who I was, some people didn't. And the conversations I had in the eastern part of the country, and again, this is my first tour when the war hadn't started, 2006, 2009, was a delight. I will tell you one story on that one. So I went out and trained with some Ukrainian soldiers.
Were you still in fighting shape?
I was in fighting shape enough that part of their training was airborne, was parachutes, parachute jumps. And my military defense attaché came in and said, you know, Mr. Ambassador, we're going to go train with the Ukrainian. And I said, great. What are you going to do? Well, we're going to train with the airborne troops. I said, great. What are you going to do? Well, we're going to jump. I said, great. I want to come. And he sucked in air through his teeth. You know, said, I'm not sure this is a good idea. So he had to check with, you know, U.S. Army Europe. I didn't tell my bosses in the State Department. I didn't tell my wife until afterwards. But I went out and jumped with them, trained with them, jumped with them, and the general on the ground said, "Oh, did you like that? Yep. You want to do it again? Yep." But that was the kind of thing that you got to do. You know, you go to universities and you go to people's houses, and that was the highlight of all of my time there.
Well, Ambassador Taylor, it's been an absolute pleasure talking with you, and thanks to everyone in our audience for coming out this evening.
Thank you, Peter. Peter, very nice job. Very nice job. I really, again, like I said at the beginning, really appreciate the opportunity to talk with this many people. I mean, this is a lot of folks here, so congratulations on this great university you got going here. And I would love, I'll be around if anybody wants to have any further questions. And great carols coming out of the tunnel center.
Again, thank you very much, and thanks everyone for being here.